The ballroom fell silent when Valentina Greco raised her hand. She didn't even try to hide the disgust on her face. She stared at Dylan Porter, then said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Stupido, you show up to my daughter's recital dressed like a tradesman? This is why single fathers shouldn't be allowed in prestigious programs." The crowd gasped. Some laughed nervously. One woman whispered to her companion, "Does he even know what fork to use? Or does he eat with his hands?" Dylan didn't flinch. He stood there, calm but his jaw tight, his hand never leaving his daughter's shoulder. He looked like someone they could dismiss, until an older man in an impeccable suit stood from the corner table and everything changed. They had judged him without knowing a single thing. When the truth came out, it left them all speechless. Let us know. What would you say to Dylan? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Dylan Porter wasn't the kind of man who commanded attention in upscale social circles. At 37, he moved through life with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone but himself. His calloused hands and perpetually paint-stained fingernails told the story of honest work, though they revealed nothing of the empire he once helped build. Each morning began the same way, rising at 5:30 a.m. sharp, preparing breakfast with the precision of someone who understood that small rituals created stability. The Harrington Academy Spring Gala was not his natural habitat. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors while a string quartet played softly in the corner. Women in designer gowns glided past buffet tables laden with foods Dylan couldn't pronounce. Men in tailored suits discussed stock portfolios and vacation homes in the Hamptons. Dylan stood near the refreshment table in his only suit, a navy piece he'd bought off the rack 3 years ago for his daughter's enrollment interview. It was clean and pressed, but unmistakably humble next to the bespoke creation surrounding him. His daughter, Sophie, had begged him to attend. She was performing a violin piece she'd been practicing for months, her small fingers working tirelessly each evening after he returned from the restoration site. Dylan would sit in their modest apartment above the hardware store, listening to her practice while he sketched building designs he no longer had the credentials to submit professionally. Her determination reminded him so much of her mother that sometimes he had to leave the room to collect himself. The other parents had always kept their distance. Dylan understood why. He arrived at school functions in his work truck, usually running late from a job site. He couldn't contribute to fundraising galas or sponsor school wings. His conversations about structural integrity and historical preservation techniques didn't mesh well with discussions of private jets and summer homes in the Mediterranean. The mothers looked through him as if he were part of the catering staff. The fathers never extended invitations to their golf outings or networking dinners. Valentina Greco made her entrance exactly 15 minutes after the event's official start time, a calculated delay that ensured maximum attention. She was striking in the way that unlimited wealth and careful maintenance could achieve. Her Valentino gown probably cost more than Dylan's annual rent. Diamonds glittered at her throat and wrists, cold fire that announced her status before she spoke a word. She was the Academy's largest donor, a real estate magnate who had transformed Boston's waterfront with luxury developments that displaced entire neighborhoods. Her daughter, Isabella, was Sophie's only friend at Harrington. The two girls had bonded over their shared love of music, spending lunch periods discussing composers and techniques. Dylan had met Valentina exactly twice before, both times brief exchanges where she'd looked at him the way someone might notice a stain on expensive upholstery, mildly annoyed but not worth extensive consideration. When Sophie's turn came to perform, Dylan felt his chest tighten with familiar pride and anxiety. She walked to the center of the small stage they'd erected, her violin tucked under her chin, wearing the simple black dress they'd found at a consignment shop. She looked so small under the lights, so vulnerable. Then she began to play. The piece was Vivaldi, complex and demanding. Dylan watched her fingers dance across the strings, watched the concentration on her face, watched the way she lost herself completely in the music, just like her mother used to. For those 4 minutes, nothing else existed. The whispers about his worn suit faded. The sidelong glances disappeared. There was only Sophie and the music she was creating. When she finished, the applause was enthusiastic. Dylan clapped until his hands hurt, his eyes burning with tears he refused to let fall in public. Sophie's face glowed as she took her bow, her eyes immediately seeking his in the crowd. He gave her a thumbs up, their private signal. As parents mingled afterward, Dylan made his way toward Sophie. She was standing with Isabella, both girls animated and laughing. That's when Valentina Greco intercepted him. "Mr. Porter," she said, her Italian accent thickening with disdain. She looked him up and down with unconcealed judgment. "I need to speak with you about your daughter's friendship with Isabella." Dylan stopped, immediately on alert. "Is there a problem?" "The problem, Mr. Porter, is appropriateness." Valentina's voice carried, drawing attention from nearby groups. "Isabella is being groomed for a certain caliber of social circle. Your daughter, while musically adequate, comes from a very different world." "They're friends," Dylan said quietly. "They enjoy each other's company. Friendship is a luxury that must be strategic at this level," Valentina continued, her voice rising. Several parents had stopped their conversations to listen. "Isabella will attend preparatory programs in Europe this summer. She will be introduced to families of significance. Your daughter's presence in her life is becoming a distraction from more suitable associations." Dylan felt heat rising in his chest, but kept his voice level. "Sophie makes Isabella happy. Isn't that what matters?" Valentina laughed, a sharp sound without warmth. How charmingly naive. This is exactly why single fathers shouldn't be raising daughters in environments they cannot possibly understand. You work with your hands, Mr. Porter. You have no concept of the social architecture required at this level. She gestured at his suit with one manicured hand. You show up to formal events dressed like you're attending a job interview at a bank. You drive that ridiculous truck with paint cans in the back. Do you even realize how embarrassing it is for Isabella when the other families ask about her friend whose father is a common laborer? The conversations around them had completely stopped now. Everyone was watching. Dylan saw pity in some faces, amusement in others, and in a few, the cruel satisfaction of watching someone being put in their place. Sophie had noticed the commotion. Her face was pale, her joy from the performance evaporating as she watched her father being humiliated. "Mrs. Greco?" Dylan began, but she cut him off. "It's Signora Greco, and I'm not finished. I have tried to be tolerant. I have tried to make allowances because Isabella is fond of your daughter. But this cannot continue. You may think that by enrolling Sophie here, you've given her access to a better life. But you're fooling yourself. She will always be the scholarship girl with a father who shows up smelling of turpentine." Valentina stepped closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow still carried. "Stupido. You think you belong here? You think your daughter belongs here? This academy is for families who understand legacy, who understand cultivation of proper connections. You are a painter of houses, Mr. Porter. A man who climbs ladders for a living. The kindest thing you could do for Sophie is to withdraw her and enroll her somewhere more suited to her station. Dylan's hands clenched at his sides, but his voice remained steady. Sophie earned her place here through her talent and hard work. She has every right to be here. Rights? Valentina's eyebrow arched. How American. This isn't about rights, Mr. Porter. This is about knowing your place, and your place is not among us. She turned to the crowd, playing to her audience now. This is what happens when we let compassion override common sense. We dilute excellence. We compromise standards. We allow people who cannot possibly appreciate what we've built to contaminate it with their mediocrity. Dylan looked past her to where Sophie stood, tears streaming down her face. Isabella had her arm around her friend, looking at her mother with an expression of confused hurt. In that moment, Dylan made a decision. He would not give these people the satisfaction of seeing him break. "If you'll excuse me," he said quietly, "I need to congratulate my daughter on her beautiful performance." He walked past Valentina Greco with his head high, ignoring the whispers that erupted in his wake. When he reached Sophie, he knelt down to her level, wiping her tears with his thumb. "You were magnificent," he whispered. "Your mother would have been so proud." Dylan Porter's alarm went off at 5:30 a.m. every morning, without exception. His apartment above Chen's Hardware on the east side of Portland was modest. Just 3 rooms with slanted ceilings and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. But every inch of it was carefully maintained, every surface clean, every object in its designated place. Not from obsession, but from necessity. Organization was the scaffold that held their lives together. The kitchen was barely large enough for 2 people to stand in, but Dylan had learned to work efficiently in small spaces. While the coffee brewed, he prepared Sophie's lunch with the same attention to detail he applied to his restoration work. A turkey sandwich on whole wheat, cut diagonally because she'd once mentioned she preferred it that way. An apple sliced into segments because whole fruits came back uneaten. A small container of hummus with baby carrots. A homemade cookie wrapped in wax paper, the recipe her mother had perfected years ago. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He tucked a note into her lunch bag, a ritual he'd started the first day of kindergarten and never stopped. Today's read: "The music you make brightens the whole world, especially mine. Love, Dad." Small words that carried the weight of everything he couldn't always express when exhaustion made him quiet in the evenings. Their apartment told a story of 2 lives, intertwined. Sophie's violin stood in its stand near the window where the light was best for practice. Dylan's drafting table occupied the corner of the living room, covered with sketches and blueprints he worked on late at night, projects that would never be built but kept his skills sharp and his mind engaged. The walls were covered with Sophie's artwork from over the years, a gallery of her growth from crayon scribbles to sophisticated watercolors. On the bookshelf sat framed photographs. Sophie at various ages, always smiling. Dylan and Sophie together at parks, museums, concerts, and one photo that Dylan's eyes always found, even when he wasn't consciously looking. A wedding photo, faded now, showing a younger Dylan in a tuxedo standing beside a woman whose beauty came from the intelligence in her eyes and the warmth of her smile. Elena Porter had been an architect, brilliant and passionate about sustainable urban design. The renovation site where Dylan currently worked was a Victorian mansion in the historic district, a project that required the kind of meticulous attention to period accuracy that few craftsmen possessed anymore. He'd been hired by the Morrison Historical Society to restore the ornate plasterwork, hand-painted ceiling medallions, and intricate crown molding. It was skilled work that paid decently, but offered no benefits, no security, no path to advancement. His co-workers were good men who worked hard and went home to their families. They knew Dylan was raising a daughter alone, but they didn't pry. They'd seen the occasional sketch he made during lunch breaks and ribbed him good-naturedly about being too fancy for regular construction work. Dylan took the jokes with grace. These men had accepted him without judgment, and that was worth more than they knew. The other parents at Harrington Academy saw a house painter. They didn't see the precision required to match 150-year-old plaster techniques. They didn't see the chemical knowledge needed to safely remove lead paint without damaging original surfaces. They didn't see the architectural understanding required to assess structural integrity while preserving historical authenticity. They saw calloused hands and assumed simple thoughts. Dylan's truck was a 1998 Ford F-150 with 200,000 miles on it. The paint was faded. The passenger door had a dent from a parking lot incident years ago, and the bed was perpetually filled with drop cloths, paint cans, and equipment. It was utilitarian and unglamorous. Everything the luxury vehicles in Harrington's parking lot were not. But it was paid off, reliable, and served its purpose. Every evening at 6 p.m., Dylan finished work and drove straight to Harrington to pick up Sophie from after-school music practice. He was always the last parent to arrive, still wearing his work clothes because there was no time to go home and change. The other parents collected their offspring in business attire or athleisure that cost more than Dylan's weekly grocery budget. They chatted about weekend plans and vacation destinations while Dylan stood apart, smelling of mineral spirits and joint compound. Sophie never complained. She would bounce out of the music room, violin case in hand, and chatter about her day during the drive home. She told him about the pieces her teacher wanted her to learn, about the composers she was discovering, about her dreams of someday performing in concert halls. Dylan listened to every word, asking questions that showed he understood the technical challenges she described, offering encouragement that wasn't empty praise, but genuine appreciation of her skill. Their evenings followed a comfortable pattern. Homework at the kitchen table while Dylan prepared dinner, usually simple fare but always nutritious and made from scratch. Then Sophie's practice time, an hour and a half of scales and pieces that Dylan had learned to appreciate even when his ears grew tired. He would sit on the worn couch with his sketch pad, drawing while she played, the scratch of his pencil a quiet accompaniment to her music. After practice came their reading hour. They took turns choosing books, everything from classic literature to contemporary fiction to biographies of great architects and musicians. Sometimes they read silently, side by side on the couch. Sometimes Dylan read aloud, doing different voices that made Sophie laugh. These hours were sacred, a buffer against the world that judged them insufficient. The walls of their small apartment held secrets the Harrington families would never imagine. The sketches scattered across Dylan's drafting table weren't idle doodling. They were sophisticated architectural designs incorporating principles of sustainable urban development. The textbooks on his shelf covered advanced structural engineering, historical preservation techniques, and innovative building technologies. The notebook filled with calculations and material specifications revealed a mind that understood complex systems and elegant solutions. Dylan's hands, so calloused and paint-stained, could render a perspective drawing with professional precision. They could calculate load-bearing requirements and design structural supports. They could read the language of old buildings and understand how generations of craftsmen had solved problems with limited tools and unlimited ingenuity. These same hands braided Sophie's hair each morning, made her lunch, signed her permission slips, and applauded at her recitals. On Friday nights, they had a standing date. Dylan would finish work early, and they would explore Portland together. Art museums where Dylan explained composition and perspective, while Sophie related everything to music theory. The historic architecture walk where Dylan pointed out different periods and styles, teaching Sophie to read the stories buildings told. The farmers market where they selected ingredients for weekend cooking experiments. These outings cost little but created wealth that had nothing to do with money. The other Harrington parents saw a scholarship student and her working-class father. They didn't see the private education in art, architecture, music theory, and critical thinking that happened in that small apartment above the hardware store. They didn't see the sophisticated discussions about aesthetics and culture. They didn't see how Dylan was raising a daughter who understood that worth came from character and capability, not from designer labels and social positioning. Sunday mornings, Dylan and Sophie volunteered at the community center, teaching art classes to neighborhood youngsters who couldn't afford private lessons. Dylan showed them basic drawing techniques, while Sophie helped with music fundamentals. The gratitude of families who struggled just to keep food on the table reminded Dylan what truly mattered. These people didn't care about his pedigree or his profession. They cared that he showed up consistently and treated their loved ones with respect. In the quiet moments after Sophie fell asleep, Dylan would stand in her doorway watching her breathe. This perfect person he and Elena had created. The weight of raising her alone never lessened, but neither did his determination. He was enough. They were enough. Together, they were building a life of substance, even if the Valentina Grecos of the world couldn't recognize it. The night after the gala humiliation, Dylan sat at his drafting table, unable to focus on the sketch before him. The apartment was quiet. Sophie finally asleep after crying herself into exhaustion. The other students had been cruel the next day at school, emboldened by their parents' gossip. "My mom says your dad is basically a janitor," one girl had announced at lunch. "Isabella's mom says you don't really belong here." Dylan pulled open the bottom drawer of his drafting table, the one that stuck slightly and required a specific angle to open. Inside, beneath old sketch pads and rolled blueprints, was a wooden box. He hadn't opened it in over a year. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. The first item was a photograph, professional and glossy. It showed a younger Dylan, clean-shaven and wearing an expensive suit, standing in front of a gleaming glass building. Beside him stood Elena, radiant in a tailored dress, her dark hair pulled back to reveal the elegant line of her neck. They were holding a model of a building between them, their faces alight with pride and possibility. The caption at the bottom read, "Porter and Associates Architects win International Sustainable Design Award." Dylan traced Elena's face with his finger, remembering everything about that day. They'd been 28 years old, partners in every sense of the word. The building in the model was the Seattle Community Center, their breakthrough project that had garnered international attention. It was a masterpiece of sustainable design, incorporating solar arrays, rainwater harvesting, green roofs, and passive heating and cooling systems while maintaining classical aesthetic beauty. Elena had been the visionary. She saw buildings not as isolated structures, but as living parts of urban ecosystems. She understood how architecture could heal communities rather than divide them. Her designs were revolutionary in their thoughtfulness, creating spaces that served multiple income levels, that brought people together rather than segregating them by wealth. Dylan had been the engineer who made her visions possible. He could translate her soaring ideas into structural reality, finding elegant solutions to seemingly impossible challenges. Together, they'd been formidable. Porter and Associates had been more than a firm, it was a mission. They'd wanted to prove that beautiful, sustainable architecture didn't have to be the exclusive domain of the wealthy. The next item in the box was a leather portfolio, worn now but still quality. Dylan opened it to reveal newspaper clippings, magazine features, and award certificates. Young architects revolutionize urban planning. Porter and Associates bring sustainable design to low-income communities. Husband-wife team wins humanitarian architecture prize. There were photographs of their projects. An affordable housing complex in Oakland that used innovative modular design to create beautiful, efficient homes. A community library in Phoenix that served as a cooling center during heat waves while generating its own power. A mixed-use development in Denver that included market-rate condos, subsidized housing, commercial space, and public parks in seamless integration. Dylan remembered the 80-hour weeks, the passionate arguments about design philosophy, the thrill of seeing their ideas take physical form. He remembered city council meetings where they'd fought for their vision against developers who wanted cheaper, uglier, more profitable alternatives. He remembered Elena's fierce determination that architecture should serve humanity, not just wealth. They'd met in graduate school at MIT. Two scholarship students who'd clawed their way into an elite program. Elena from a working-class neighborhood in Chicago. Dylan from a small town in Oregon where his father had been a carpenter and his mother a public school teacher. Neither of them had come from money or connections. They'd built their success through talent, determination, and unwavering commitment to their principles. The wedding photo in the box showed a simple ceremony in a botanical garden. Neither of them had wanted the expensive spectacle that their more affluent classmates favored. They'd invited 30 people, served homemade food, and Elena had worn a vintage dress she'd found at a consignment shop. It had been perfect. A celebration of love rather than a display of wealth. Sophie had been born 3 years into their marriage. Dylan could still remember holding her for the first time, this tiny person who was half him and half the woman he loved more than he'd thought possible. Elena had taken 6 weeks of maternity leave, then returned to work with new fire. She wanted to build a better world for their daughter, one where housing was a right, where public spaces welcomed everyone, where architecture served the common good. The firm had been thriving. They'd just secured funding for their most ambitious project, a comprehensive redevelopment of a struggling Portland neighborhood that would provide mixed-income housing, green spaces, community facilities, and job training centers. It was everything they'd been working toward, proof that their model could transform entire communities. Dylan found the invitation in the box, the corners now soft with age. Portland City Council invites Porter and Associates to present the Riverside Commons project. The date was circled in red. March 15th, 7 years ago. The presentation that never happened. Elena had been driving to the site for a final survey. Dylan was supposed to go with her, but Sophie had woken up with a fever. "Stay with our girl," Elena had said, kissing his forehead. "I'll handle the survey and be back in a few hours." She'd been smiling, excited about the project, talking about how it would establish their firm as leaders in community-centered urban design. The call came 2 hours later. A drunk driver had crossed the median on the interstate. Elena's car was hit head-on at 65 miles per hour. She died instantly, the police told him. She hadn't suffered. As if that made the devastation any less complete. Dylan remembered the weeks after as a blur of agony. Well-meaning friends and colleagues had tried to help, but their efforts felt hollow against the magnitude of his loss. Sophie, barely 4 years old, kept asking when Mommy was coming home. The firm's partners had wanted him to take time off, then come back and continue Elena's legacy. "She'd want you to finish the work," they'd insisted. But Dylan couldn't do it. Every design they'd created together was Elena's vision. Every project was a conversation between their complementary talents. Without her, the work felt like a lie. He would be taking credit for ideas that weren't his, building monuments to a partnership that no longer existed. And Sophie needed him in a way that allowed for no divided attention. The dissolution of Porter and Associates had been financially catastrophic. Dylan had walked away from his equity, from ongoing projects, from a reputation he'd spent years building. The other partners had been bewildered and then angry. Investors threatened lawsuits. Clients demanded he honor his commitments. But Dylan was drowning in grief and responsibility. He could barely function enough to get Sophie to preschool and keep her fed. The complex demands of running an architectural firm were impossible. He'd sold their house to pay off debts and obligations, packed up Sophie and their essential belongings, left Seattle where every street corner held memories of Elena. They'd moved to Portland, to this modest apartment above a hardware store, because it was affordable and anonymous. Because no one here knew him as half of Porter and Associates. Because he could rebuild something smaller but more manageable. The owner of Chen's Hardware, an older man named Thomas, who'd immigrated from Taiwan 40 years earlier, had offered Dylan handyman work. Dylan had accepted gratefully. The work was simple, requiring only a fraction of his skills, but it was honest and it paid the rent. Thomas never asked about Dylan's past or why a man with his obvious education was fixing leaky faucets and painting trim. Within 6 months of Elena's death, Dylan had transformed from an award-winning architect to a restoration craftsman. The transition hadn't been a dramatic fall so much as a deliberate descent. Each step away from his former life, a conscious choice made in the dark hours when Sophie slept and grief threatened to consume him whole. Thomas Chen had been the first person in Portland to offer Dylan something beyond pity. The older man had watched Dylan fix a broken shelf in the hardware store with an efficiency that suggested deeper expertise. "You know buildings," Thomas had observed. Not a question, but a statement. "I have customers who need good restoration work, historic homes, people who care about doing it right. Interested?" Dylan had hesitated. Restoration work was several rungs below architecture on the professional ladder. But Sophie needed stability, food, routine. She needed a father who came home at predictable times, who wasn't traveling to project sites or locked in his office until midnight reviewing plans. She needed someone present, not someone brilliant, but absent. "Yes," Dylan had said simply. "I'm interested." Thomas had nodded, asking nothing more. That restraint, that respect for privacy, had been a gift Dylan hadn't known he needed. In Seattle, everyone had wanted to discuss his loss, to offer therapeutic platitudes, to suggest timelines for his grief. Thomas simply handed him a list of clients and said, "Good work speaks for itself." The first projects had been humbling. Scraping paint from Victorian trim, repairing cracked plaster, matching historical color palettes. Work that required patience and attention to detail, but nothing like the intellectual challenge of designing a building from foundation to roof. Dylan's MIT education and years of innovative design experience were monumentally overqualified for determining the correct shade of cream for a 1890s dining room. But there was unexpected solace in the simplicity. When his hands were busy with tangible tasks, his mind couldn't spiral into the abyss of what he'd lost. When he was matching the grain pattern on replacement molding, he wasn't thinking about the Riverside Commons project being completed by other architects. When he was carefully restoring hand-painted ceiling medallions, he wasn't imagining Elena's reaction to designs he'd never create. The work also connected him to something Elena had valued deeply: preservation. She'd always argued that sustainable architecture wasn't just about new construction, but about honoring and maintaining existing structures. "The greenest building is the one already built," she used to say. "We just need to help it function better." In his small way, Dylan was continuing that philosophy. Sophie had been too young to understand what they'd lost beyond her mother. She didn't know that the cramped apartment was a vast reduction from their spacious Seattle home. She didn't know her father had once commanded six-figure fees for design consultations. She knew only that Daddy went to work, came home, and was always there when she needed him. That consistency, that presence, was worth more than any career achievement. Dylan had enrolled Sophie in public school initially, a perfectly good elementary program where she'd thrived academically and made friends. But when her music teacher had pulled him aside to discuss Sophie's exceptional talent, everything shifted. "Mr. Porter, your daughter has something rare," the teacher had explained. "Perfect pitch, natural musicality, and the discipline to develop it. She should be studying with a specialist, attending a program that can cultivate this gift properly." The teacher had recommended Harrington Academy, Portland's most prestigious private school with a renowned music program. Dylan's first instinct had been to dismiss it as impossible. The tuition alone was more than his annual income. But the teacher had persisted. "They have scholarships for exceptionally talented students. Sophie deserves the chance." The application process had been excruciating. Dylan had filled out forms detailing his financial situation, exposing the gap between his education and his current circumstances. He'd written essays about Sophie's potential while carefully omitting the details of his own past. The interview had been worse, sitting across from administrators who clearly couldn't reconcile his credentials with his profession. "You have a master's degree from MIT in architecture," one had noted, confusion evident. "Yet you work in restoration?" "I work with my hands to support my daughter," Dylan had answered. "My education serves me well in understanding structural systems and historical building techniques." They'd accepted Sophie on a full scholarship, a decision Dylan suspected was based entirely on her audition performance, and nothing to do with him. The letter had specified that Sophie was being admitted for her exceptional musical talent, and that the scholarship came with expectations of continued excellence. From the first day at Harrington, Dylan had known they were outsiders. The other families arrived in luxury vehicles, wore clothing that cost more than his monthly rent, discussed vacation homes and private tutors with casual ease. They looked at Dylan's work truck and paint-stained hands with barely concealed disdain. He'd endured it because Sophie was flourishing. Her violin teacher was a former professional who recognized and nurtured her talent. She was learning music theory, composition, performance technique. She was being challenged in ways the public school couldn't provide. She was becoming the musician she was meant to be. Every scholarship renewal required Dylan to prove their continued financial need. Every year, he submitted the same humbling documentation showing his modest income, his lack of assets, their dependence on Harrington's generosity. It was a yearly reminder that they were there on sufferance, charity, cases among the privileged. The other parents' treatment of him hardened over time. Initial curiosity about the scholarship father gave way to dismissiveness. He wasn't invited to parent social events. He wasn't included in the informal networks where families shared information and opportunities. He existed on the periphery, tolerated because his daughter's talent reflected well on the school's music program. Dylan had made peace with this isolation because the alternative was worse. Returning to architecture would mean long hours, travel, the consuming nature of ambitious projects. It would mean Sophie raised by nannies and after-school programs, seeing him only in the fragments of time between professional obligations. It would mean repeating the mistake so many of his former colleagues made, sacrificing family for career achievement. He'd watched those colleagues during his years at Porter and Associates, brilliant architects whose offspring barely knew them, men and women who could design buildings that would stand for centuries but couldn't tell you their son's favorite color or their daughter's fears. They delegated parenting the way they delegated routine drafting work to competent others while they focused on more important matters. Elena had been different. Even at the height of their success, she'd insisted on boundaries. Family dinners were sacred. Bedtime routines were non-negotiable. She'd turned down prestigious projects that would have required extended absences. "We're building a family, not just a firm," she'd said. "Success means nothing if we're strangers to our daughter." After her death, Dylan had clung to that philosophy like a lifeline. He would be present. He would be available. He would prioritize Sophie's daily needs over his own professional potential. The world had taken Elena from them, but it wouldn't take his presence from Sophie. So he'd chosen the humble path deliberately and completely. He'd traded prestige for proximity, achievement for availability, innovation for involvement. He fixed other people's beautiful buildings instead of designing his own because it allowed him to pick Sophie up from school, to attend her recitals, to be there for homework questions, midnight nightmares. The sacrifice was invisible to people like Valentina Greco. They saw only the surface, a working-class father who didn't belong in their world. They couldn't imagine that he'd once occupied a higher tier than most of them, that he'd walked away from success they could only envy. They assumed he was scrambling upward through Sophie's scholarship, trying to access a world beyond his reach. The truth was precisely opposite. Dylan had descended deliberately, trading everything he'd built professionally for something he valued more. Being the father Sophie needed every single day. Not the brilliant architect who created buildings that would outlive him. Not the visionary designer who transformed communities. Just dad. Reliable and present, fixing what was broken and building a life that, while modest, was wholly theirs. The morning after Valentina Greco's public humiliation of Dylan, a formal letter arrived from Harrington Academy. The heavy cream stationery bore the school's embossed seal, its weight and quality announcing importance before Dylan even opened it. He read it standing in his small kitchen, coffee growing cold in his hand. "Dear Mr. Porter, the Harrington Academy Scholarship Committee requires an emergency review of Sophie Porter's continued enrollment. Please attend a meeting on Friday, March 10th at 2:00 p.m. to discuss matters pertaining to family circumstances and student welfare. Attendance is mandatory. Failure to appear will result in immediate scholarship suspension." Dylan read it 3 times, searching for specifics that weren't there. Family circumstances could mean anything. Student welfare was deliberately vague. The mandatory attendance and threat of immediate suspension left no ambiguity about the power dynamic. He was being summoned, not invited. He called his supervisor at the Morrison Restoration site, a decent man named Keith who'd always been flexible about Dylan's parenting responsibilities. "I need Friday afternoon off. School meeting." "Everything okay with Sophie?" Keith asked, concern genuine. "I'm not sure yet," Dylan admitted, "but I need to be there. Take the time. We'll manage." The meeting room at Harrington was designed to intimidate. A long mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. 6 people sat on one side. Principal Whitmore, 2 school board members, the director of student services, the head of the music department, and Valentina Greco. A single chair faced them on the opposite side, positioned like a defendant before judges. Dylan sat down. his work clothes suddenly feeling more shabby than usual in this room of tailored suits and designer dresses. He'd come straight from the restoration site, not having time to go home and change. Plaster dust probably still clung to his hair. Principal Whitmore opened a folder. Her expression practiced neutrality. "Mr. Porter, thank you for coming. We need to discuss some concerns that have arisen regarding Sophie's home environment and your capacity to provide appropriate support for a student in our program." "What concerns specifically?" Dylan asked. One of the board members, a silver-haired woman named Dr. Pemberton, slid a document across the table. "We've received reports that Sophie has been experiencing social difficulties. Withdrawal from peer groups, emotional distress, signs of anxiety that suggest instability in her home life." Dylan scanned the document, recognizing immediately that these observations had been taken out of context and amplified. Sophie has been upset because other students have been cruel to her after Mrs. Greco publicly stated she doesn't belong here. "Mr. Porter," Valentina interjected smoothly, "you misunderstand. My concern was for Isabella's social development." But it raised larger questions about whether Sophie is truly thriving in this environment. Perhaps a school more suited to her background would serve her better. The director of student services, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. "We've also noted that you've been consistently late for pickup. Last week alone, you were late 3 times. This suggests difficulty managing your professional obligations alongside parenting responsibilities." "I was late because we had an emergency at the restoration site," Dylan explained. "A structural issue that required immediate attention. I notified the after-school program each time, and Sophie was supervised until I arrived." "The pattern suggests inconsistency," Dr. Pemberton countered. "Harrington families typically have the resources to ensure prompt, reliable pickup. Nannies, drivers, flexible work arrangements that accommodate school schedules. I'm one person doing the work of 2 parents," Dylan said quietly. "Sometimes there are delays. But Sophie is never unsupervised, and she knows I'll always come for her." The head of the music department, a stern woman named Professor Clark, opened another folder. "We also have concerns about Sophie's practice environment. Our students typically have dedicated music rooms with proper acoustics, climate control, and professional-grade instruments. Can you describe Sophie's practice space at home?" Dylan felt heat rising in his chest. "She practices in our living room. The violin is rented through the school's instrument program. She practices 90 minutes every evening without fail." "A living room in an apartment above a hardware store," Valentina said, her tone making it sound sordid. "With noise from the street, customers coming and going, hardly conducive to developing serious musicianship." "Sophie's teacher has never complained about her preparation," Dylan said. "Her technical progress has been excellent." Professor Clark consulted her notes. "Sophie is talented, certainly, but talent requires cultivation in the proper environment. We must consider whether her current circumstances allow for the level of dedication our program demands. Several students from families with greater resources have been waitlisted. Perhaps one of them would benefit more from the scholarship opportunity." The implication was clear. Sophie was taking a slot that could go to someone from the right kind of family. Someone whose parents could make substantial donations. Someone who wouldn't embarrass the school with their working-class father. Principal Whitmore presented another document. "We'd like you to complete this comprehensive family assessment. It will be reviewed by our consulting psychologist to ensure Sophie's home environment meets our standards for student welfare." Dylan scanned the questions. They were invasive and loaded. "Describe the emotional support systems available to your daughter. Detail your financial stability and future prospects. Explain your qualifications for addressing the unique developmental needs of a gifted female student. Every question was designed to highlight his deficiencies as a single father with limited means. You're putting my daughter's scholarship under review because I don't have enough money, Dylan said bluntly. That's what this is really about. Mr. Porter, Dr. Pemberton said with manufactured patience. This is about Sophie's best interests. Sometimes loving a person means acknowledging when we cannot provide what they need. There are excellent public school music programs that might be more appropriate for your family's circumstances. Over the next 2 weeks, the campaign intensified with surgical precision. Sophie came home with a note from her guidance counselor requesting a meeting to discuss her socialization patterns. The meeting revealed that other parents had expressed concerns about Sophie's friendship with their daughters, citing the difficult family situation. What difficult situation? Dylan had demanded. The counselor had been apologetic but firm. Single-parent homes, especially single fathers with daughters, can create complicated dynamics. The other parents feel more comfortable with playdates in traditional family settings. Invitations that had been rare before stopped completely. Isabella was forbidden from sitting with Sophie at lunch, her mother having decided the friendship was no longer appropriate. Sophie ate alone, a visible marker of her outsider status. The school's annual fundraising gala sent out invitations with a note at the bottom. Suggested contribution, $5,000 per family. The amount was more than Dylan's monthly income. When he didn't respond, he received a follow-up email noting that family participation in fundraising was considered in scholarship renewal decisions. The music department announced a summer intensive program in Vermont, a month-long workshop with renowned instructors. Cost, $8,000 plus travel. Professor Clark mentioned casually that serious students were expected to attend. When Dylan explained he couldn't afford it, she'd frowned with disappointment. I see. Well, we'll make note of that. Anonymous notes started appearing in Sophie's locker. Charity case. Your dad is a janitor. You don't belong here. Sophie brought them home, trying to be brave, but Dylan saw how they wounded her. The parent WhatsApp group that Dylan had never been added to was apparently buzzing with gossip. He knew because other parents started looking at him differently, with pity or disdain, depending on their nature. Sophie reported that mothers were discussing his situation at pickup. Voices lowered, but not enough. The final blow came in the form of another letter. The scholarship committee had decided that Sophie's continuation at Harrington required additional conditions. Dylan must attend mandatory parenting workshops for single fathers, provide quarterly reports from a family therapist confirming Sophie's emotional well-being, and maintain perfect attendance for all school events, regardless of work conflicts. The message was clear. They were making it impossible for him to succeed, stacking requirements they knew he couldn't meet, building a documented case for removal. All orchestrated with polite language and expressed concern for Sophie's welfare, when the real goal was eliminating the scholarship student whose father embarrassed them. Dylan sat on the floor of Sophie's room long after she'd cried herself to sleep. The latest incident had been the cruelest yet. Sophie's violin teacher, under pressure from Professor Clark, had removed her from the spring recital's featured performance. The explanation was diplomatic but transparent. We feel Sophie might benefit from a less prominent role this year, given the various pressures she's experiencing. The featured piece had been Paganini, technically demanding and perfect for Sophie's advancing skills. She'd been practicing it for 3 months, her fingers flying over the strings with increasing confidence. Now it would be performed by Valentina Greco's daughter Isabella, whose technique was adequate but unremarkable. The message couldn't be clearer. Know your place. Sophie had maintained her composure until they got home. Then she'd collapsed on her bed, sobbing with the kind of heartbreak that made Dylan's chest physically ache. I worked so hard, Daddy. I practiced every single day. Why do they hate us? Dylan had held her, stroking her hair, whispering reassurances he wasn't sure he believed anymore. They don't hate us, sweetheart. They're just scared of people who are different from them. Maybe we should leave, Sophie had whispered. Go to a different school where nobody knows us. The defeat in her voice had shattered something in Dylan. His strong, talented daughter was being systematically broken by people who should have been nurturing her gifts. And he was powerless to stop it. Now, surrounded by the evidence of their life together, Dylan felt the full weight of his inadequacy. Sophie's room was filled with her achievements, certificates from music competitions, ribbons from school exhibitions, photographs of performances, all proof of her exceptional talent, all rendered meaningless by the machinery of exclusion grinding against them. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, stopping at a name he hadn't called in 6 years. Richard Morrison, his former business partner at Porter & Associates. Richard had taken over the firm after Dylan left, successfully completing the Riverside Commons project and several others. He'd reached out periodically over the years, always with the same message. When you're ready to come back, we have a place for you. Dylan had never responded. The idea of returning to architecture had felt like a betrayal of the choice he'd made, the life he'd built with Sophie. But now, staring at that name, he wondered if he'd been wrong. Maybe Sophie would be better off with a father who could afford Harrington's unspoken price of admission. A father who belonged in rooms with people like Valentina Greco. A father who wasn't an embarrassment. His finger hovered over the call button. Richard would welcome him back. The firm was thriving and could offer a senior partnership. The salary would transform their circumstances overnight. Sophie could stay at Harrington without the constant threat of scholarship review. He could afford the summer programs, the right clothes, the correct social signals. They could move out of this apartment into a house in the right neighborhood. He could stop being the charity case and become someone the other parents had to respect. But at what cost? Dylan looked at the clock. 11:47 p.m. Sophie would wake at 6:30, expecting breakfast and her daily note. If he returned to architecture, there would be client dinners that ran late, site visits that required travel, design deadlines that demanded all-night work sessions, the intense, consuming nature of ambitious projects that had defined his life before Elena's death. He could give Sophie money and status, but he'd lose the daily presence that had been his promise to her, to Elena's memory, to himself. Dylan stood and walked to his own room, opening the closet where his old portfolio still resided. He pulled it out, spreading his best design work across the bed. The Seattle Community Center, elegant and functional. The Oakland housing complex that had won humanitarian awards. The Phoenix Library that served as a model for sustainable public architecture. This was who he'd been. Someone whose work mattered on a scale beyond individual lives. Someone who changed skylines and transformed communities. Someone Elena had believed in completely. He looked at his current sketchbook, filled with measured drawings of Victorian molding profiles and plaster ceiling medallions. Competent work, but so small compared to what he used to do. Was this enough? Had he made Sophie's life better or worse by choosing this path? The assessment documents from Harrington sat on his desk, still incomplete. Questions designed to expose his inadequacies. Describe your long-term career prospects and how they will provide for your daughter's future opportunities. Explain your support network for addressing your daughter's complex developmental needs. Detail your plan for ensuring your daughter receives appropriate female guidance and role modeling. Every question was a trap. Every answer would be weighed against invisible standards he could never meet. He was being judged by people who measured worth in dollar signs and social connections, people who couldn't conceive that value might exist in other forms. Dylan pulled Elena's photograph from his nightstand. She smiled at him across the years, forever 31, forever brilliant, forever gone. "I don't know what to do, Elle," he whispered. "I'm failing her. You'd know how to fight this. You always knew how to stand up to people like them." But Elena wasn't there to guide him. He was alone, making decisions that would shape Sophie's entire future. And he was drowning in doubt. His phone buzzed with an email, another message from the Harrington Parent Association about the upcoming gala fundraiser. The email included photographs from last year's event: women in evening gowns, men in tuxedos, champagne and elaborate floral arrangements. The caption read, "Join the Harrington family in supporting excellence in education." Dylan stared at the photographs, at these people who decided Sophie didn't belong in their family. At Valentina Greco, prominent in several shots, laughing with other donors. At the world of wealth and privilege that measured his daughter and found her wanting because of him. Maybe they were right. Maybe Sophie deserved better than a father who could only offer love and presence, who couldn't open the doors that money and connections unlocked. Maybe the kindest thing would be to step aside, to let her be adopted by one of those church families who'd offered. They could give her stability, a mother figure, access to opportunities he'd never provide. The thought made him physically ill, but he forced himself to consider it. Sophie was only 10. She'd adapt. She'd grow up with advantages he couldn't imagine providing. She'd learn to forget him eventually, remember him as a loving but inadequate first chapter in a better story. Dylan closed his eyes, feeling tears he'd been holding back for weeks finally fall. He'd survived combat zones, built award-winning structures, overcome devastating grief. But this battle against systematic exclusion and quiet cruelty was breaking him in ways bullets and bombs never had. He didn't know if he was strong enough to keep fighting. Didn't know if winning was even possible against people with unlimited resources and absolute certainty in their righteousness. Didn't know if forcing Sophie to stay in a place that rejected her was courage or selfishness. All he knew was that tomorrow morning he'd have to wake up and pretend everything was fine. Make breakfast, write an encouraging note, send his daughter into a school that was actively working to expel her, and somehow find the strength to believe it would be okay. Dylan woke at 3 a.m., his heart pounding from a dream he couldn't quite remember. The apartment was silent except for the distant hum of traffic on the street below. He lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on his chest. Unable to sleep, he got up and wandered to the kitchen, intending to make coffee. But his feet carried him instead to Sophie's doorway. She was curled on her side, one hand tucked under her pillow, her face peaceful in sleep. The nightlight cast soft shadows across her features. And Dylan saw Elena in the curve of her cheek, the shape of her nose. He stepped quietly into her room, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Her violin case rested against the wall, covered in stickers she'd carefully selected. Treble clefs, famous composers, inspirational quotes about music. Her music stand held the Paganini piece she'd been practicing, the one she'd been told she couldn't perform. The sheet music was covered in her careful pencil markings, fingering notations, dynamic reminders. Dylan's gaze traveled to her bulletin board, covered with photographs and mementos. pictures of her and Isabella before Valentina had forbidden the friendship. A program from her first recital at Harrington. A ribbon from a citywide youth music competition where she'd placed first in her division. And there, in the center, a drawing she'd made years ago. He stepped closer to examine it. The drawing showed two figures, one tall and one small, holding hands. Above them, a third figure floated among clouds and stars, arms outstretched as if embracing them both. Sophie's handwriting, careful and young, labeled the figures, Daddy, me, and Mommy watching over us. Dylan felt something crack open in his chest. He'd been so focused on his own inadequacy, so consumed by the judgment of people like Valentina Greco, that he'd lost sight of what actually mattered. Sophie didn't need him to be wealthy or socially prominent. She needed him to be exactly what he'd promised Elena he would be. Present, loving, unwavering. He returned to his room and pulled out the wooden box again. But this time, he looked at the contents differently. These weren't reminders of failure or lost potential. They were evidence of what he was capable of when he believed in something worth fighting for. The award certificates weren't just professional achievements. They represented battles won against developers who wanted to cut corners, against city officials who preferred the status quo, against cynics who said sustainable design for low-income communities was impossible. He and Elena had proven them all wrong through sheer determination and refusal to compromise their principles. Dylan pulled out a letter he'd saved, one of the last things Elena had written before her death. It had been intended for Sophie, to be given to her when she was older. He'd read it only once, on the first anniversary of Elena's death, and then tucked it away because the pain was too raw. Now he opened it again, his hand steadying as he read his wife's words. My darling Sophie, if you're reading this, it means I'm not there to tell you these things myself. But I need you to know who your father is. He's the strongest person I've ever met, not because of physical strength, but because he knows what matters and never wavers from it. When everyone else was designing buildings to impress other architects, your father designed buildings to serve people. When others chased prestige, he chased purpose. He's brilliant, Sophie, but more importantly, he's good. The world will try to tell you that success means wealth and status. Don't believe it. Success means staying true to your values, even when it costs you everything. Your father taught me that. He'll teach you too if you let him. Whatever challenges you face, remember that you come from people who fought for what was right, not what was easy. Your father will show you how to be brave. Trust him. Love him. He's the best man I've ever known. Dylan read the letter 3 times, hearing Elena's voice in every word. She'd known him better than he knew himself. She'd understood that his strength wasn't in buildings or awards, but in his capacity to love fiercely and protect what mattered most. He thought about the wooden box again, about the life it represented. He'd been looking at it as something lost, a past he'd abandoned. But maybe it was actually proof that he knew how to fight battles that seemed impossible. He'd taken on entire systems and won. He'd created something meaningful from nothing. He'd stood his ground against people who had more money and more power. Valentina Greco and her allies were just another kind of opponent, different from the ones he'd faced in his architectural career, but not fundamentally more formidable. They had wealth and social position, but those weren't unbeatable advantages. They were bullies hiding behind politeness and procedure, and bullies could be defeated. Dylan went to his drafting table and pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. He began to write. Not a design this time, but a strategy. He listed every attack they'd made, The emergency scholarship review, the invasive family assessment, the social isolation of Sophie, the removal from the recital, the impossible conditions being imposed. Then he analyzed each one, looking for weaknesses, inconsistencies, violations of Harrington's own stated policies. The emergency review had been triggered by concerns that were never specifically documented. The family assessment included questions that violated privacy protections. The social isolation was being orchestrated by adults in positions of authority, not arising organically from students. The recital decision contradicted the music department's own merit-based selection criteria. The fundraising pressure violated scholarship agreements that explicitly stated financial contribution was not required. They'd been sloppy, confident that a single father with no resources couldn't fight back effectively. They'd underestimated him because they saw only the surface. The paint-stained hands, the old truck, the modest circumstances. They had no idea who they were actually dealing with. Dylan thought about the networks he'd abandoned when he left architecture. Former colleagues who owed him favors, journalists who'd covered his award-winning projects, education advocates who fought against exclusionary practices in elite schools, civil rights attorneys who specialized in discrimination cases. He'd walked away from that world, but the connections still existed if he chose to reactivate them. He pulled out his laptop and began drafting emails. To Richard Morrison, not asking for a job, but asking for a different kind of help. I need the contact information for that education reporter at the Portland Tribune, the one who covered our community center project. I have a story she might find interesting. To Sarah Chen, an attorney he'd worked with on zoning, battles. Do you still handle discrimination cases? I think Harrington Academy is violating their own scholarship policies and possibly state education law. To Professor Williams at Portland State, who taught educational equity. Would you be willing to review some documents related to a private school's treatment of scholarship students? I think you'll find the patterns disturbing. Dylan worked through the night, building his case with the same meticulous attention to detail he'd once applied to architectural plans. Every claim would be documented. Every attack would be cataloged. Every policy violation would be highlighted. He would turn their own procedures against them, show that their concern for Sophie's welfare was a pretense covering systematic exclusion. As dawn light began filtering through the windows, Dylan heard Sophie stirring. He closed his laptop and went to the kitchen, starting the coffee maker and pulling out ingredients for her favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes shaped like music notes. When she emerged from her room, eyes still sleepy, he had everything ready. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said, kissing the top of her head. She looked at him curiously, sensing something different in his demeanor. "Are you okay, Daddy?" Dylan knelt down to her level, taking both her small hands in his. "Sophie, I need you to listen to me carefully. Some people are trying to make us leave Harrington. They think we don't belong there because we don't have as much money as they do. They've been making things difficult, making you feel like you're not good enough." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "I know. I'm sorry, I'm not—" "Stop," Dylan said firmly but gently. "You have nothing to apologize for. You are extraordinarily talented. You work harder than any other student in that music program. You earned your place there through your own merit, and nobody has the right to take that away from you." "But Mrs. Greco said—" "Mrs. Greco is wrong," Dylan interrupted. "And I'm going to prove it. We're going to fight this, Sophie. Together. Because your mother didn't raise a quitter, and neither did I. Do you understand?" Sophie nodded slowly, something like hope flickering in her eyes. "We're not leaving?" Not unless they drag us out kicking and screaming, Dylan said with a slight smile. And even then, they're going to have one hell of a fight on their hands. For the first time in weeks, Sophie smiled genuinely. She threw her arms around Dylan's neck, holding tight. He held her back, feeling the strength that had carried him through combat and loss and grief flowing back into his bones. He'd been looking at this wrong, seeing himself as insufficient when he should have been seeing himself as a fighter who'd temporarily forgotten how to fight. Valentina Greco had made a critical mistake. She'd assumed Dylan's quiet demeanor meant weakness. She'd confused his humble circumstances with lack of capability. She'd thought she could crush him because he was alone. She had no idea what was coming. The formal hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at Harrington Academy's main conference room. Dylan had received the official notification 2 weeks prior, a document heavy with legal language and institutional authority. The letter specified that the Scholarship Review Board would conduct a comprehensive evaluation of Sophie Porter's continued eligibility for financial assistance, and that Mr. Dylan Porter's presence was mandatory. Dylan arrived 15 minutes early, wearing the same navy suit he'd worn to the spring gala. This time, though, he carried a leather briefcase that had once held architectural plans for projects worth millions. Inside were carefully organized documents, correspondence, recordings, and evidence he'd been methodically gathering for 3 weeks. The conference room was designed to intimidate. A massive table dominated the space, surrounded by high-backed chairs upholstered in burgundy leather. Portraits of Harrington's founders lined the walls, stern men in Victorian attire staring down with expressions of perpetual judgment. Windows overlooked the manicured grounds where students from wealthy families played during recess, a visible reminder of the world Dylan was supposedly unfit to access. The review board was already seated when Dylan entered. Principal Whitmore sat at the head of the table, flanked by Dr. Pemberton and 3 other board members Dylan recognized from various school functions. Valentina Greco occupied a seat slightly apart from the official board, present as the concerned parent who had initiated the review process. The school's attorney, a sharp-featured man named Mr. Blackwell, sat with a stack of folders before him. A single chair faced them all, positioned in a way that made the power dynamic brutally clear. Dylan was the defendant. They were the jury, judge, and prosecutor combined. Mr. Porter, Principal Whitmore began, her voice professionally cool. Thank you for attending. This review has been convened to address serious concerns regarding Sophie Porter's home environment and your capacity to provide the support necessary for a student in our demanding program. Dylan said nothing, simply meeting her gaze steadily. He'd learned long ago that silence could be more powerful than premature argument. Mr. Blackwell opened his folder. We have documentation of concerning patterns. Tardiness for pickup on 14 occasions over the past semester. Failure to participate in mandatory fundraising activities. Inability to provide adequate practice facilities. Incomplete responses to our family assessment questionnaire. And most troubling, signs of emotional distress in Sophie that correlate directly with instability in her home situation. He slid documents across the table. Dylan glanced at them but didn't touch them. He knew what they said. He'd anticipated every argument. Dr. Pemberton spoke next, her tone carrying false sympathy. Mr. Porter, no, one doubts your love for your daughter. But love alone isn't sufficient for raising a child with Sophie's exceptional gifts. She requires resources, stability, opportunities that extend beyond what a single parent in your economic situation can realistically provide. Furthermore, another board member added, we have testimony from other parents expressing concern about Sophie's socialization. The consensus is that she would benefit from a more traditional family structure. perhaps through our foster placement program with one of Harrington's established families. Valentina Greco leaned forward, her expression calculated compassion. Mr. Porter, I have personally offered to facilitate Sophie's placement with a wonderful family. The Hendersons are pillars of our community. With 3 daughters of their own, they could provide Sophie with siblings, a mother figure, educational opportunities, including summer programs in Europe. She would remain at Harrington, excel in our music program, and have the life she deserves. You want me to give up my daughter? Dylan said quietly. We want what's best for Sophie, Principal Whitmore corrected. Sometimes that means making difficult decisions. You've done admirably given your limitations, but Sophie's needs are outgrowing your capacity to meet them. Mr. Blackwell presented more documents. We have statements from teachers noting Sophie's declining enthusiasm, from the guidance counselor documenting increased anxiety, from other parents describing concerning behaviors that suggest neglect of her social and emotional development. The pattern is clear, Mr. Porter. Your circumstances are harming your daughter. For 2 hours, they presented their case. Each board member contributed evidence of Dylan's inadequacy. The attorney framed everything in language of child welfare and best interests. Valentina Greco punctuated key points with personal observations about Sophie's potential being wasted in Dylan's care. Dylan listened to it all without interruption. He watched them build their mountain of concern and documentation. He noted how they referenced policies selectively, how they interpreted Sophie's normal childhood struggles as evidence of systemic failure. He recognized the strategy because he'd seen it before in zoning battles and permit hearings. Overwhelm the opponent with volume, bury the truth under enough official-sounding language that resistance seems futile. When they finally finished, Principal Whitmore folded her hands on the table. Mr. Porter, do you have anything to say before we render our decision? Dylan opened his briefcase and pulled out a single folder. Actually, I do. But first, I'd like to introduce someone who's been observing these proceedings. He gestured to the back of the room where the door opened. A tall, silver-haired man in an expensive suit entered, followed by a younger woman carrying recording equipment. The board members exchanged confused glances. This is James Patterson from the Oregon Department of Education, Dylan said calmly. And this is Rebecca Walsh from the Portland Tribune's education desk. I invited them to observe because I thought they'd be interested in what happens when a prestigious private school systematically violates state education law and its own charter requirements. Principal Whitmore's face went pale. Mr. Porter, this is a private institutional matter. It stopped being private when you violated Sophie's rights under Oregon educational discrimination statutes. Dylan interrupted. Ms. Walsh has been researching Harrington's scholarship program for the past 2 weeks. Would you like to know what she found? Rebecca Walsh stepped forward, consulting her tablet. Harrington Academy receives substantial tax benefits for maintaining a scholarship program that supposedly serves economically disadvantaged students. However, over the past 5 years, 12 scholarship students have been removed from the program. 11 of them were from single-parent households. All 11 were subsequently placed with families who are major donors to Harrington. She looked directly at Valentina Greco. In fact, Mrs. Greco has personally facilitated 4 such placements, each resulting in the receiving family making substantial financial contributions to the school. The pattern suggests systematic abuse of the scholarship program to funnel students toward wealthy donors. Mr. Blackwell stood abruptly. These are serious allegations without foundation. I have the foundation right here, Dylan said, opening his folder. Emails between Principal Whitmore and board members discussing how to encourage scholarship families to withdraw voluntarily. Text messages between Mrs. Greco and other parents coordinating the social isolation of Sophie. Recording of Professor Clark admitting that Sophie's removal from the recital was not merit-based, but rather done to appease major donors. He spread documents across the table. I also have testimony from 3 former Harrington families whose children were removed from the scholarship program under similar circumstances. Affidavits from teachers who were pressured to file negative reports about students whose parents didn't fit Harrington's social profile. And financial records showing the correlation between scholarship removals and donation increases. James Patterson spoke for the first time, his voice carrying quiet authority. The Department of Education takes violations of scholarship program requirements very seriously. If Harrington has been using its tax-advantaged scholarship program as a mechanism for social engineering and fundraising, that's fraud. The school could lose its accreditation and tax-exempt status. Dr. Pemberton found her voice. This is outrageous. We have acted entirely within our rights. You've violated your own charter? Dylan said, his voice hardening. Your scholarship criteria specify that continuation is based solely on academic performance and adherence to school rules. Sophie has a 3.9 GPA and has never violated a single school policy. Yet, you've subjected her to reviews based entirely on my economic status and family structure, both of which are explicitly protected categories under your own non-discrimination policy. He pulled out another document. This is Harrington's official policy on scholarship students, approved by your own board 5 years ago. It states clearly that scholarship families are full members of the school community and will not be subject to different standards or expectations. Yet you've demanded I attend parenting workshops, submit to psychological evaluation, and participate in fundraising at levels impossible for my income. All conditions never imposed on non-scholarship families. Principal Whitmore's composed facade was cracking. Mr. Porter, you're mischaracterizing our concerns, am I? Dylan's voice cut through her protest. Let's talk about those concerns. You claim Sophie shows signs of emotional distress. I have emails showing that Mrs. Greco instructed other parents to exclude Sophie from social activities. You arranged that distress deliberately, then used it as evidence against me. He turned to Valentina. You told students that Sophie didn't belong here. You forbade your daughter from being her friend. You publicly humiliated me to establish a narrative that would justify removal. This wasn't about Sophie's welfare. This was about eliminating a scholarship student who reminded your donors that not everyone here comes from wealth. Valentina's face flushed with anger. How dare you? I dare because I have proof, Dylan said simply. The silence in the conference room was absolute. Valentina Greco stared at Dylan with an expression that cycled through shock, rage, and finally, the cold calculation of someone reassessing a badly misjudged opponent. Principal Whitmore's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. The other board members exchanged panicked glances, suddenly aware that the comfortable authority they'd wielded moments ago had evaporated. James Patterson from the Oregon Department of Education stepped forward, his presence transforming the dynamic entirely. I've been reviewing Harrington Academy's scholarship program administration for the past 10 days, based on complaints Mr. Porter filed with our office. What I've discovered is deeply troubling. He placed a tablet on the table, turning it so the board members could see. This is a data analysis of your scholarship program over the past 7 years. The pattern is unmistakable. Scholarship students from single-parent households are retained at a rate 60% lower than those from two-parent households, despite having equivalent or superior academic performance. Students whose parents cannot make substantial financial contributions face review processes at 4 times the rate of other scholarship recipients. Principal Whitmore attempted to interject. Our review processes are designed to ensure student welfare. Your review processes are designed to create justification for removal. Patterson interrupted, his tone sharp. I've examined 15 cases in detail. In every instance, the actual concerns raised could have been addressed through standard support services that Harrington provides to non-scholarship families. But scholarship families were instead subjected to invasive evaluations, impossible conditions, and systematic pressure to withdraw. Dr. Pemberton's voice was defensive. We have the right to maintain standards. You have the obligation to apply those standards equally. Patterson countered. Harrington Academy receives over $2 million annually in tax benefits for operating an accredited scholarship program serving economically disadvantaged students. Those benefits come with legal requirements. You've violated at least 7 state education statutes and your own charter provisions. Rebecca Walsh from the Portland Tribune had been typing rapidly on her tablet. Now she looked up, her expression one of journalistic satisfaction at uncovering a significant story. I've also been investigating the financial connections. Mrs. Greco, you've facilitated the placement of 4 scholarship students with donor families over the past 3 years. Those same families subsequently made combined donations exceeding $800,000 to Harrington. That's not charity, that's effectively purchasing students. Valentina's composure finally shattered. This is slander. Those families provided loving homes to students who needed them. The donations were separate charitable contributions. The timeline suggests otherwise, Walsh said, consulting her notes. In each case, initial donor contact occurred within 2 weeks of the scholarship student's placement. Donations were formalized within 60 days. And in 3 of the 4 cases, the placed students were removed from scholarship status and converted to full tuition students paid for by their new families, freeing up scholarship slots that remained mysteriously unfilled the following year. She turned to Principal Whitmore. Which reduced your scholarship obligations while maintaining the tax benefits. That's fraud, Principal Whitmore. That's using vulnerable families as pawns in a fundraising scheme. Dillon had remained quiet, letting the evidence speak. Now he pulled out one final document. This is a letter from the Henderson family, the people Mrs. Greco suggested should adopt Sophie. They were very forthcoming once I explained the situation. Apparently, Mrs. Greco approached them 6 weeks ago with what she called an opportunity to add a musically gifted daughter to their family, while making a meaningful contribution to Harrington's music program. The suggested contribution was $250,000. He slid the letter across the table. The Hendersons are decent people who were genuinely interested in helping a young person in need. They had no idea they were being recruited as part of a scheme to remove scholarship students and replace them with donor-funded alternatives. Mr. Blackwell, the school's attorney, had been rapidly consulting his own files. His face had gone ashen. Principal Whitmore, I need to speak with you and the board privately, immediately. That won't be necessary, Patterson said. The Department of Education will be conducting a formal investigation beginning tomorrow. Harrington's accreditation is suspended pending the outcome. All scholarship-related decisions made in the past 18 months are frozen until reviewed for compliance with state and federal education law. He looked directly at Principal Whitmore. This means Sophie Porter's scholarship status is fully reinstated without conditions. Any attempt to retaliate against her or her father will be considered obstruction of a state investigation and will result in immediate revocation of Harrington's operating license. Principal Whitmore seemed to age 10 years in that moment. Her carefully constructed world of controlled admissions and cultivated donors was collapsing around her. "Mr. Patterson, surely we can discuss this reasonably." "There's nothing to discuss," Patterson said flatly. "You've systematically violated the public trust. Private schools that accept tax benefits for scholarship programs are bound by strict compliance requirements. You've treated those requirements as suggestions and vulnerable families as resources to exploit. The consequences will be severe." Dylan spoke again, his voice quiet but carrying absolute authority. "I want to be clear about something. I didn't do this for revenge. I did this because Sophie deserves better. All the scholarship students deserve better. You took families who were working hard to give their loved ones opportunities, and you made them feel ashamed. You weaponized their economic circumstances against them. You created a system where students earned their places through merit, but were judged by their parents' bank accounts." He looked at each board member in turn. "Every single scholarship student at this school has talent that earned them admission. They work harder than most of your donor family's offspring because they understand the value of the opportunity. And you've been systematically telling them they don't belong, that their families are insufficient, that they should be grateful for whatever scraps of dignity you choose to offer." Valentina Greco found her voice, though it lacked its earlier confidence. "Mr. Porter, you clearly have more to your background than you've shared. Perhaps if you'd been forthcoming about your credentials." "My credentials are irrelevant," Dylan interrupted. "I shouldn't need a prestigious past to be treated with basic respect. The mechanic's daughter deserves the same opportunities as the billionaire's daughter if she has the talent and work ethic. That's supposed to be the entire point of scholarship programs. But you've perverted that mission into a social sorting mechanism that protects privilege and punishes difference." He stood, gathering his documents. "Sophie will remain at Harrington under her full scholarship. She will not be subjected to any special reviews or conditions beyond those applied to all students. She will participate in the spring recital performing the Paganini piece she's been practicing, because Professor Clark's own rubric shows she's the most qualified student for that performance." Professor Clark, who had been silent throughout the confrontation, nodded weakly. "Of course, Sophie's technical ability is exceptional. The change was administrative, not artistic." "The change was discriminatory," Dylan corrected. "And it ends now." Rebecca Walsh closed her tablet. "My article goes live tomorrow morning. I'll be documenting the Department of Education's investigation and following up with interviews from affected families. Mr. Porter has provided contact information for several former Harrington families who are willing to share their experiences." She looked at Valentina Greco with particular focus. "I'm also investigating the financial relationships between scholarship placements and donor contributions. If there's evidence of fraud or exploitation, criminal charges may follow." Valentina stood abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. "I will not sit here and be slandered. Your attorneys will advise you to cooperate fully with the investigation," Patterson said calmly, "and to hope that the district attorney's office doesn't find sufficient evidence for criminal prosecution. Using your position on the school board to facilitate what amounts to child trafficking for fundraising purposes is a serious felony, Mrs. Greco." The color drained from Valentina's face. Without another word, she grabbed her designer handbag and left the conference room, her heels clicking rapidly down the hallway in retreat. Principal Whitmore seemed to collapse inward. "The board will need to meet to discuss our response. The board will cooperate completely with the state investigation," Patterson said firmly. and you'll immediately suspend all scholarship review processes pending establishment of new oversight procedures. I'll be assigning a compliance monitor who will have full access to all student records and administrative communications. He handed her a business card. My office will be in contact tomorrow with a formal notice of investigation and a list of required documentation. I suggest you retain counsel, Principal Whitmore. The violations are serious enough that personal liability may attach. Dylan walked toward the door, then paused. One more thing. The other scholarship families who've been made to feel unwelcome here deserve an apology and assurance that the harassment will stop. If I hear of any retaliation or continued discrimination, I'll be back with more documentation and more witnesses. This ends completely, or it becomes a much larger problem for everyone involved. He left the conference room without waiting for a response. In the hallway, he found Sophie waiting on a bench with Isabella beside her. The two girls had apparently reconciled on their own, united by the injustice they'd witnessed. When Sophie saw her father, she jumped up and ran to him. "Did we win?" she asked, her voice a mixture of hope and fear. Dylan knelt down to her level, taking both her hands. "We won, sweetheart. You're staying at Harrington. You're performing your Paganini piece. And nobody is going to make you feel like you don't belong here anymore." Sophie threw her arms around his neck, and Dylan held her tight, feeling the weight of the past months lifting from his shoulders. Over Sophie's shoulder, he saw Isabella watching with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry," Isabella said quietly. "My mother was wrong. You do belong here, Sophie. You're the best violinist in the whole school." Sophie pulled back from Dylan and went to her friend, hugging her fiercely. "It's not your fault. I'm just glad we can be friends again." The two girls held each other while Dylan stood, watching them reclaim the friendship that had been taken from them. This was what mattered. Not the confrontation in the conference room or the victory over institutional discrimination. The fact that Sophie could stand in these hallways with her head high, knowing she belonged because of her talent and character, not despite her father's economic circumstances. Over the next week, changes rippled through Harrington Academy. Principal Whitmore took an immediate leave of absence. 3 board members resigned. The Department of Education's investigation became front-page news, with Rebecca Walsh's article sparking a broader conversation about private school accountability and scholarship program integrity. Dylan received calls from 4 other private schools in Portland, each apologizing for similar treatment of scholarship families and requesting his input on reforming their policies. He agreed to consult, using his architectural background and experience with institutional systems to help design more equitable approaches. The most surprising call came from Richard Morrison, his former business partner. "I read the Tribune article," Richard said. "I had no idea what you'd been dealing with. Listen, I know you chose the craftsman's path for Sophie's sake, and I respect that. But we're designing a new community center in Southeast Portland. Mixed-income housing, public spaces, sustainable systems, everything you and Elena believed in. I need someone who understands both the technical requirements and the human impact. Interested in consulting, flexible hours, work from home when needed, project-based so you control your schedule." Dylan had hesitated, then agreed. It wasn't a return to his old life, but rather an integration of past expertise with present priorities. He could contribute meaningfully to projects that mattered while maintaining the presence in Sophie's life that remained his primary commitment. Sophie's spring recital performance was transcendent. She played the Paganini with technical precision and emotional depth that had the audience on their feet before the final note faded. Dylan watched from the front row, his eyes burning with proud tears, as his daughter took her bows to thunderous applause. Afterward, several parents approached him, offering genuine apologies for their previous treatment. Dylan accepted them with grace, understanding that people could change when confronted with their own prejudices. Not everyone had been complicit in Valentina's scheme. Some had simply followed social cues without questioning the underlying injustice. 3 months later, the Department of Education released its findings. Harrington Academy was fined $500,000 and required to implement comprehensive reforms to its scholarship program. Valentina Greco faced criminal charges for fraud and child endangerment. The investigation revealed she'd been receiving kickbacks from families who adopted scholarship students, payments disguised as consulting fees for her real estate business. Dylan and Sophie stood in their small apartment one evening, looking at college brochures that had started arriving. Sophie was only 11, but conservatory programs were already expressing interest based on her performance videos. Juilliard, Curtis, Berkeley, schools that represented the pinnacle of musical education. "Do you think Mom would be proud of us?" Sophie asked, holding a photograph of Elena. Dylan pulled her close. "I know she would be. Not because of the schools interested in you or the case we won. Because you stood up for yourself. Because you stayed true to your music, even when people tried to make you feel small. Because you're kind and talented and brave." He looked around their modest apartment, at the life they'd built together. It wasn't the life he'd imagined when he and Elena had started their firm. It wasn't the prestigious career or the financial success or the professional recognition. But it was something more valuable, a relationship built on presence and love. A daughter growing into exactly who she was meant to be. "Your mother used to say that the best buildings are the ones that serve people, not the ones that impress other architects," Dylan said softly. "I think the same is true of lives. We've built something good here, Sophie. Something real and true and worth protecting." Sophie nodded, leaning against her father. "I'm glad we didn't give up." "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." Outside, the city lights of Portland glowed in the gathering dusk. Somewhere, other families were fighting their own battles against systems designed to exclude them. Other talented young people were being told they didn't belong because of circumstances beyond their control. Other single parents were questioning whether their love was enough. Dylan hoped that what had happened at Harrington would make those battles slightly easier, would remind people that worth wasn't measured in wealth or social position. That dignity was a right, not a privilege. That families came in many forms, all of them valid when built on love and commitment. He'd been a soldier of sorts in this battle, fighting not with weapons, but with documentation and determination. He'd been an architect again, but of justice rather than buildings. And most importantly, he'd been a father, protecting his daughter's right to pursue her dreams without shame or apology. In the end, that was the only credential that truly mattered. 5 years later, Dylan Porter stood in the wings of Boston's Symphony Hall, adjusting his tie for the 3rd time. The venue was magnificent, all soaring architecture and perfect acoustics, the kind of space he'd once dreamed of designing but now appreciated from a different perspective entirely. "You're more nervous than I am," Sophie said, appearing beside him in her concert dress. At 16, she'd grown into a poised young woman whose resemblance to Elena sometimes took Dylan's breath away. She carried her violin case with the casual confidence of someone who'd performed on stages across the country. "I'm allowed to be nervous," Dylan replied, kissing the top of her head. "It's not every day your daughter performs as a featured soloist with a major symphony orchestra." Sophie smiled. That same radiant expression Elena used to have when discussing a project she loved. "You know what Mom would say right now?" That technique is important, but the music has to come from somewhere true, Dylan answered, repeating words Elena had often used about architecture. That the audience can tell when you're just going through motions versus when you believe in what you're creating. Exactly. Sophie squeezed his hand. I'll see you after. And Dad, thank you for everything. She disappeared toward the stage entrance, leaving Dylan to find his seat in the audience. He wasn't alone. Thomas Chen sat beside him, the hardware store owner who'd given Dylan his first job in Portland and had become something like family over the years. Next to Thomas was Richard Morrison, whose community center project had evolved into a full partnership that allowed Dylan to practice architecture again on his own terms. Isabella Greco sat 2 rows ahead with her father. Valentina had lost custody during the criminal proceedings, and Isabella's father had proven to be a kind man who'd been largely absent during his ex-wife's schemes. Isabella and Sophie had remained close friends, their bond strengthened by the adversity they'd faced together. Several other Harrington scholarship families were scattered throughout the audience. Families Dylan had helped advocate for after his case exposed the systemic problems. The reforms at Harrington had spread to other private schools across Oregon, changing policies that had excluded deserving students for generations. Rebecca Walsh was there too, her investigative series on private school discrimination having won a regional journalism award and sparked legislative changes. She'd become a friend, someone who understood the importance of holding powerful institutions accountable. The lights dimmed. The orchestra took their positions, and then Sophie walked onto the stage, her violin in hand, looking small against the vast space, but utterly composed. The conductor raised his baton. What followed was transcendent. Sophie performed a violin concerto she'd helped arrange, a piece that blended classical technique with modern sensibilities. Her fingers flew across the strings with technical precision, but it was the emotion she conveyed that made the performance extraordinary. You could hear her story in the music. Loss and resilience, struggle and triumph. The journey from a small apartment above a hardware store to this magnificent stage. Dylan watched through tears he didn't bother hiding. This was what they'd fought for. Not the prestigious venue or the recognition, but Sophie's right to develop her gifts without apology. Her right to stand on stages she'd earned through talent and dedication, not family connections or wealth. When the final note faded, the audience erupted. The standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes. Sophie took her bows with grace, her eyes finding Dylan's in the crowd. The look they exchanged said everything words couldn't capture. At the reception afterward, Dylan found himself surrounded by well-wishers. Several were former colleagues from his Porter and Associates days, people who'd followed his story and wanted to reconnect. Others were parents from Harrington, relationships that had evolved from hostile to respectful to, in some cases, genuinely friendly once people examined their own prejudices. A distinguished older woman approached, introducing herself as the director of the New England Conservatory. Mr. Porter, I wanted to speak with you about Sophie's future. We'd very much like her to consider our program when she graduates. Full scholarship, naturally, based on merit. Dylan shook her hand. Sophie makes her own decisions about her future, but I'll make sure she knows about your interest. I also wanted to say, the director continued, that your case 5 years ago changed how we evaluate students. We implemented new policies ensuring that talent is recognized regardless of family circumstances. You did more than fight for your daughter. You fought for every young person who deserves a chance. Later, as Dylan and Sophie walked through Boston streets toward their hotel, she linked her arm through his. Do you ever wonder what life would have been like if we'd given up? if I'd gone to live with the Hendersons? Dylan stopped walking, turning to face her. Not for a single second. This, right here, this is exactly where we're supposed to be. Together. Sophie hugged him tightly. I love you, Dad. Thank you for being stubborn enough to fight for us. I love you too, sweetheart, and I'd do it all again in a heartbeat. They continued walking, a father and daughter who'd faced down systems designed to separate them and emerged stronger. Behind them, Symphony Hall's lights glowed against the night sky, a monument to the power of music and the importance of fighting for what matters most. Somewhere, Elena was smiling. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.